Hello humans, today I wanted to talk a little bit about this knife right here and more generally this design philosophy that old school knives have that we don't see very much anymore and the very particular reasons why we don't see it very much anymore. So first thing first, this is actually a buck knife. You can see the old school buck logo right there on the handle insert. This is a Buck 319. It features two blades made from 420 HC high carbon steel and a carbon steel awl and just general Marlin spike tool that is actually made out of carbon steel. You can see its corrosion, and I'm pointing that out for a very specific reason. So this knife right here was actually made on a Camillus contract, and this is part of the original run of the Buck 319s. And there's a few ways to identify that. First off, we know it was made as part of one of the first two runs, so before 1990, because of the carbon steel awl. After 1990, for the third and I believe final run of this knife, it was actually made using fully stainless components, so 420, 420, and 420 HC parts. Other thing we can identify is the spiral pattern right here. That marks this as part of the first run. So the second run and sort of further on ended up using a non-spiral, a straight ribbing pattern, rather than this nice sort of slanted one that you can see right there. So that identifies this as being made sometime in between 1974 and 1982. Somewhere in and of there. It has Delrin handles, saw-cut Delrin handles, made by Camillus, like I mentioned, in New York. And this was actually something that you saw a fair amount back then between quite a few of the USA-based manufacturing companies. In particular, Buck and Camillus did this quite a bit, where they would rent out their manufacturing space and their machine time, depending on what they needed done, and they would do deals back and forth like that quite a bit. You see it sometimes in the world right now, but it is becoming less and less common as cheap overseas manufacturing becomes more and more popular. So, saw-cut Delrin handle, scales. As you can see, brass frame, this nickel brass bolsters, along with a nickel brass shield, and full brass pins. The back springs are obviously carbon steel back springs. We have a main blade, straight clip point. The swedge is actually only on one side, which isn't something that was uncommon on old school multi-blade slip joints, in particular multi-blade slip joints, because you only ever really interact with this side of the blade, right? Like the rest of the time, it's flat up against there. I'm not a huge fan of it personally, but it is kind of cool. I will admit that. Long pull tab, very, very simple clip point blade. Whoever owned this before me obviously used this quite a bit, but they did do a fairly good job keeping it sharp, which is quite nice. You do have a sharpening choil, and you have your Buck USA and your model number marking. So the second blade that we have here is actually an equally well loved by the seam of it, which is a little bit scary. You can see the tip there. This is actually a spay blade. And you can see it was resharpened by somebody who didn't care very much about the original angles, but this is actually a spay blade. It is for neutering animals, in particular bulls and like goats, sometimes horses, although you'd most likely not want to do that with a horse in the field, depending on circumstances. This is at the earliest the mid 70s, so by this point in time it would have fallen out of fashion, but it still likely was done, so I'm not going to completely dismiss it. Anyway, yeah, so this is for neutering your animals, cutting the balls off, essentially. So, neat little blade, a little concerning that it got that much use, but still kind of cool and fairly useful. And then we have, oh yeah, our leatherworking awl. It actually has a sharpened edge, like this edge right here. It's not sharp, but it is crisp, and it has a sharp point. So that allows it to be used also as a marlin spike. This is actually a really nice knife for untying tight knots and stuff like that, just because you have a very useful marlin spike tool. So, repairing your tent, fixing up leather goods, that sort of a thing, it is quite useful for. And it is, like I mentioned, a properly sharp awl. You can use this effectively as an awl, which is not awls. You can't use all awls on slip joint as awls. So, I mentioned before that this knife covers a very, very particular sort of philosophy around old school folding knives. And what I mean by that is old school multi-bladed knives got around using sort of mid-range or somewhat subpar handle blade materials by using multiple blades, right? So on a more modern knife, you can get away with just having one larger blade by having a nicer blade steel, something that's going to hold an edge a little bit longer, require less maintenance, less touch-ups. So if you are out, for example, in a field tending to cattle for, let's call it 2-week rotations, right? You are potentially spending 2 weeks living out of a riding pack. You don't always want to be carrying around a full sharpening set in your riding pack because, quite simply, they're heavy and they take up a lot of space. You might keep like a leather strap, some diamond compounds. You might have a little bit of ceramic that you can use in a pinch to, bring your edge back up. But in general, what you're going to want is multiple blades. If my bigger blade is getting quite dull and the strap isn't popping it back to where I need it to be, I can switch over to using the smaller blade as my primary blade. And that's one of the main reasons why we saw 3 or even, 4-bladed knives in this time period, because having multiple blades meant that you could increase the longevity of the knife between services. And if you're out, a couple weeks at a time doing animal care, that kind of thing, extending your usable time between servicings becomes more and more valuable. So I do think it is quite interesting that you see this sort of making up for subpar materials with multiple blades, and it's something you still see in some knives today. Buck obviously has their line of traditional slip joints. You've got the Schrade. I think they have the Uncle Henry and the Old Timer series. I believe those are both under Schrade, but if not, it'll be written there. But both of those have some traditional slip joints. But I mean, the famous example that everybody has heard of here and there is actually going to be Victorinox, right? Your classic Swiss Army knife is going to have 2 blades, and it's doing the exact same thing. These are, love it or hate it, kind of subpar blade steels. They're fine. They do what they need to do, and they are quite stainless, but they don't hold an edge for super long. So having more than one blade means that your time between servicing is actually noticeably longer. The other thing is that realistically, when you're riding, when you're living out of a pack like that, you're limiting yourself down to a very, very set list of things. And there are some things that you need different blade shapes and different blade types to do. This knife is also a prime example of that because of your spay blade, right? If you're out riding around dealing with cattle all the time, having a spay blade is super, super useful and arguably essential, right? So you need to be carrying one, but it's not going to be big enough and it's not going to cover all of your needs, right? So having a secondary blade, one that you're more willing to throw at wood or potentially even camp tasks, is kind of essential. And a package like this that very easily fits into a pocket or a small pack, like this takes up significantly less room than having a dedicated spay blade and also a dedicated camp knife ever could. So there is that use to it. And, this one here also throws in the added use of having an awl tool, which would take up even more room. So I think that those are kind of the 2 main reasons why you see, especially historically, these multi-bladed knives so common. and these multi-tooled knives so commonly is just because they're super practical. And they're designed for a lifestyle that you see significantly less nowadays, in the sense of you're very, very rarely, unless you're somebody who likes to go off on like motorbike solos, or you are still somebody who does ranching professionally and is out, for weeks at a time with cattle, which even in the ranching spaces is becoming more and more uncommon to see. You are not making decisions based on space and ounces. I guess ultralight backpackers are too. I don't think about them very often, but I suppose they are technically as well. So having multiple blades in a tight, small package that you don't need to maintain for as long, right? They last longer, and it does still have its values. Now, the multiple blades, specifically for edge retention, has, like I mentioned, more or less been phased out simply by having more and more modern blade steels. Something like this Wee Banter, its single blade S35VN is going to last significantly longer than these two blades will at significantly harder tasks. That is simply the reality of it, and I'm not here to sort of take away from that. But for working with the tools that they had at the time, and that's more so with older examples, like I said, this is somewhere in the 70s or the 80s, so nowhere near as old-fashioned, nowhere near as much material limitations as we see at other times. But even so, right, you're making up for the limitations of your materials by simply having more edge, which I think is super interesting. So I'm going to do some size comparisons real quick. As you can see, with its main blade, it is actually longer than the Wee Banter. And I'm not going to do both blades at once, but I am going to do a comparison with each of the two blades. So here it is next to the Wee Banter and the Civivi Chevalier. As you can see, it is nowhere near as tall as either, but it is a little bit longer than the Wee Banter and a fair amount smaller than the Chevalier. And then here it is next to its much more famous cousin, the Buck 110. As you can see, it is significantly smaller than the Buck 110. And next to a Zippo. So now we're going to do the same thing in reverse with the smaller blade. The other thing that is somewhat unique about the 319 Rancher is that a lot of the time when you see these multi-bladed knives, the blades actually open up on different ends. With this one here, I don't know why, but they opted instead to have the two blades on one side and the awl tool on the other side, which is just interesting. It doesn't really mean much about anything, but I do find it neat. So as you can see with the smaller blade out, like the smaller blade is shorter end to end than the Zippo is, right? It is significantly smaller than the 110, and yeah, like I said, smaller than the Zippo in that blade. Now we have, once again, our Civivi Chevalier and our Wee Banter. So now I'll line it up there. As you can see, now it is smaller than the Wee Banter, which makes a fair amount of sense. It does have a slightly longer handle than the Wee Banter does, which is kind of nice, honestly. Like, this is a very easy knife to get a very good feeling grip on, even though you have some, level of hot spots with the extra blade bumps and stuff like that. It is not uncomfortable. Thickness, here it is next to the Zippo. It is pretty well the same thickness as the Zippo. And here it is next to the 110. And as you can see, it is quite a bit slimmer than the 110. Yeah, overall, I don't think that we're ever going to go back to multi-blades as sort of the standard in knives. I think that given the materials that a knife could reasonably be expected to cut, there's no use for it anymore. Even like average steels, like a prime example being, D2, even a fairly average steel like D2 is going to have enough edge retention that you could get away with just keeping it in shape with the strop for a fairly long time. And also, we've gotten so much lighter with our sharpener technology at this point that you're never really going to be in a situation where, if you are somebody who works, you know, hours away from anybody else and you need to be able to keep a knife sharp for work or for whatever it is that you're doing, you can just carry a knife now. You can just carry a sharpener now, right? You can just carry diamond stones on a thin little plate and it will last perfectly well and do its job extraordinarily. So I think the end all be all is that we're never going to see the return to glory for knives like this, but they still are, in my opinion, a very, very fascinating piece of history. And they're still a nice thing to keep around from time to time. And this is still a perfectly serviceable knife, and it does a very good job at everything that I have tried to throw at it. Within reason, right? Don't be stupid and try and cut a tree down, but cutting up an apple for my lunch, so on and so forth, this does a very good job, and it feels really nice to use. That's all I had to say on the matter. Stay safe and have fun out there. Peace.